My name is Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive, and I'm with Charles Calello today, which is a real thrill because you actually did what I wanted to do for a living.
Ah,
I just think that um, being an arranger is such a creative thing to do, and every week, every day, is you're presented with a different issue. Would you
yeah,
agree with that statement?
yeah. Well, I started to do this as a hobby. Uh, I went to a music and arts high school, and there was there were really talented players. At the age of 13 to 16 years old, they played at a professional level. And the accordion player in the band, now we're going back to the 50s, so the accordion was a common instrument. I was an accordion player. The accordion player in that band got a scholarship to Harvard, and they needed an accordion player, so I joined the band. And the first rehearsal, they said, "Let's do almost like being in love." So the saxophone player said, "Charlie, give us the notes." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, play something on the accordion." So I played. So he says, "Great." He says, "All right, give that to the trumpet. Now give me a harmony." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, give me a note that you would play underneath it." So I listened to it. And I says, "This is really cool."
Yeah. How would you know to play biddy dip biddy dip biddy do? Just that like was inside you from listening to the radio or something?
Well, my father was a musician, and I'd studied trumpet for a while, but my father wanted me to become an accordion player because the accordion players worked at bar mitzvahs and weddings, and they always got paid extra because they worked extra hours or something. So my father wanted me to play the accordion. So I had knowledge of music from a very early age, and my father, although he played club dates, had Miles Davis records in his collection. So as a kid, I found them and I was sort of impressed over the fact that this music was appealing to me. And the first jazz record I heard was Miles, or I was at Jerry Mulligan's arrangement of Move. And I studied it. And then as I went to high school and started to meet other musicians, I found out that there were people that actually played jazz. And I became interested in it, started to learn chords and things like this. So by the time I got to the band, I had some knowledge of what to do. And we were also writing in school, we were writing uh, uh, figured bass. So I had some knowledge as to what to do, but these were head arrangements. I wasn't writing anything out.
So the accordion probably was a good thing to be playing because you were playing melodies and chords and bass notes, sort of
Right,
like arranging as you went.
right. I also learned how to play the bass lines on the accordion, and then I had my accordion amplified, and I um, worked with someone to get a low pass filter on the amp so I can get the depth like a Hammond organ. So in the 50s, I had modified the accordion to where I could play it and get a sound that was close enough to an electric organ. And that was only after I heard Jimmy Smith play. And I wanted to play, I wanted to sound like Jimmy Smith. So I learned how to play the bass lines with my left hand. And although we had a bass player in the band, he would put his bass down and sing some of the arrangements that I wrote. So I would be playing the bass line. And it was funny to see the musicians come in to look to see where the bass was coming from.
I love that. I do that now, but I do it on a keyboard. And only
Right.
rarely do I get someone will every once in a while say, like, where's the bass coming from? Or they'll say, hey, you play a pretty good bass for a keyboard player. I like that. I think I'm in another life. I was a bass player.
Well, when I went to high school, I couldn't play accordion in a band or orchestra, so I started to play bass. And between playing bass and also playing accordion, it was an interesting start. At the age of 15, now this you'll get a kick out of. At the age of 15, um, there was a place in Atlantic City that the older musicians were playing in. The kids were like 17, 18 years old, and they got another job in another place, and they needed a band to go to Eddie Shamrock, which was on Kentucky Avenue. I was 15 going on 16. I got an ABC card, spent the summer in Atlantic City for $60 a week, 7 nights a week, and two matinees. But here's what was cool. Up the street was the Harlem Club. And also the jazz musicians in that area. Uh, I got a chance to see most of the jazz greats that came in 15, 16 years old. I heard Ray Charles sing Hallelujah before the record came out.
And
So,
all that like gets inside you, I think. And later on, you may not even remember where it came from, but you use it.
well, one of the things that I learned later on was I was not a great player. Well, the musicians love the arrangements, and I knew how to make the arrangements sound great because of the accordion, because I could harmonize and play the in-between notes with the accordion, so the chords would always sound full. And that was basically how I met Frankie Valli. He came into a club that I was working in when I had graduated high school. I was going to Manhattan School of Music and still working with a band. And he walked into a club, heard the band, uh, and said, "Who wrote the arrangements?" And they pointed to me. And as a result of me getting to know Frankie Valli, ultimately I had opportunity.
What did he particularly notice? Because did you have horn players? How large was the band?
Band was five pieces. We had a trumpet player who played valve trombone and trumpet, and we had an alto player who played tenor. We had Fender bass, drums, and I played the accordion. So we also sang like the four freshmen in the high-lows. Now, uh, I copied some of the arrangements off the record. First one we started with was "It's a Blue World," which was relatively easy, especially because all the people in the band went to Arts High. They were all good musicians. They could read music, and as a result of it, we could sing. So we'd rehearse, and we found out that we could actually sing and get a sound like the four freshmen. And then we did some of the tunes from the high-lows. So Frankie comes in. Here's this band that was doing production numbers with two horns and also singing four-part harmony. And he had a band called the Four Lovers. They had a hit record or a chart record on RCA in 1956. So everybody knew who Frankie Valli was in the city of Newark. But he had heard about my band, came to hear the band, and was amazed at how we sounded. So Frankie wanted me to join the Four Lovers. So I continued, I wanted to continue to go to school. So I quit the band I was in and went to work with Frankie Valli in the Four Lovers playing bass. And the music that they did was sort of uninspiring, and they didn't want to rehearse or change. They didn't have the musicality to do the things that we were doing with the other band. What was funny about it was all the musicians in town knew who we were. The name of the group was the Victorians. We couldn't draw six people. Frankie Valli played. They had a triad band that played like four chord songs, and you couldn't get into the place.
I have to write that comment down. The triad band, no sevenths allowed.
Yeah, exactly. So, although I learned that there was a different style of music that drew people, I still, after work, drove into New York, went to Birdland, saw Miles, Cannonball, um, Coltrane, Art Blakey, and there was also a jazz club in Newark called Sugar Hill, and all the great jazz players came in, and I still followed that, listened to jazz and was sort of drawn to do that. And in 1959, uh, well, after the Four Lovers had their hit record, Elvis became popular on RCA, and the Four Lovers went on the back burner, so they lost their deal on RCA. We made a record when I was with the Four Lovers, and we brought it to Bob Crew. Bob Crew ultimately became the producer of the Four Seasons. Bob had written Silhouettes on a Shade. He also produced Freddie Cannon. So he was already an established producer making hit records. And he asked us if we wanted to be his studio band. And he would pay us $10 a piece. And we would come in to the studio at 11 or 12 o'clock at night and work all night because he can get the studio free. So we started to make records, and uh, I got an opportunity to start to make records. Now, being taught by Bob Crew, who had hit records, was how I learned pop music. He'd give me a record and he'd say, Charles, I want the rhythm to sound like this. I want the horns to play this style, and I need strings. And here's what I want the strings to do. And he'd give me records to listen to.
How did you know what strings were capable of? Was that from partly your high school education?
I had no idea, didn't have a clue. I mean, I studied scores and I saw them. So now this is also interesting. Ariana Grande on the Tonight Show mentioned that because I recorded her when she was 12 years old and wrote arrangements for her when she was 7 with the Pops here in town. But she mentioned on the Tonight Show the first record I ever made with Bob Crew. She found it and took the song and used it in one of her albums. And she said, and my grandfather's best friend, Charlie Calello, and I saw his name on the record. so so there was a little bit of a history behind that record. But now I had to write strings. Now at that point, I'd never written for strings. I had only written for horns. And Bob gave me an idea. And I also had some knowledge from looking at scores, but I really had no idea how quickly the string players would read it. So I wrote this arrangement, and it was only for 3 violins, and it basically was all in unison. And it had runs in it. And I went to the studio, I was panicked. I mean, I can't tell you. I kept saying to myself, I know this is gonna, I can't believe that it's gonna sound good. I put it in front of them. They played it at sight, and the second pass through, they recorded it. And then because we were double tracking, they played it a couple of times. I'm listening, and I says, God, that sounds great. So understanding that uh, there was a song that Peggy Lee recorded. I don't really remember. It was "Is That All There Is?"
Indeed.
And I left the studio and I said, "What? That wasn't hard. That's really a lot of fun."
Oh,
So
God, that's great.
then, obviously, when the Four Seasons became successful, I became the arranger, which gave me opportunity. And then my name was on records. And making a Four Seasons record, one of the drummer, Buddy Salzman, who played on pretty much all the Four Seasons hits, said to me, Charlie, he said, there's going to be 4 stages to your career. He said, who's Charlie Calello? We have to get Charlie Calello. what we need is a young Charlie Calello. And whatever happened to Charlie Calello?
Well, I'm glad to have you here. Here's what happened. That's terrific. Uh, um, was there a point where you said, "Hmm, I should be getting paid for this, and how much, and how do I charge?"
Well, I wrote the arrangements to the Big Girls Don't Cry album for $10 a piece.
And you don't get
Um,
any, you don't get any licensing or royalties for that. Is that correct?
no, later on as a producer, I did, but I was pleased to get paid because I was writing arrangements for nothing. Um, and there were a couple of interesting things about it. Um, Bob was using another arranger, but he found out that not only I could do the same job, but I could work cheaper, which I didn't know about. Then I found out that um, I should really ask him for more money because I was overloaded with stuff, and it was starting to become uh, a, a real job.
With
So,
pencil and score paper, right?
pardon?
Pencil and score paper.
Right, right.
Did you write your own parts?
Yes. No, I no, at that point, he introduced me to a copyist. And also a little history with the copyist. He wound up copying most of the music for the Boston Pops because Richard Heyman was a client of his. Later on in life, I started writing arrangements for Richard Heyman, who I became good friends with, and became the assistant conductor of the orchestra here in Boca Raton that he had for many years.
Did you write your scores in concert pitch, or did you transpose the transposing instruments in the score?
I wrote him transpose. In fact, before you called, I found the original arrangement to All by Myself that I did with Eric Carmen. Eric died about a year ago, and they're doing a tribute to him with a symphony. And it was originally a 7-minute record, and I couldn't find the long version of it. So I have the handwritten arrangement that we used for the record. So I'm transcribing it into finale, and then I'm gonna fill in the parts that are missing there's about 3 minutes of the arrangement that I can't seem to find.
You think
But
it'll come back?
I have a copy of it, and if I could share the screen, I could show you what it looked like with the hand looked a looking part looked like to All by Myself, because I got it handy.
Yeah. When we were corresponding with through email to set up this session, you said, you wrote, I just finished a project and delivered the music on Sunday. So my curiosity is, how has delivering the project, the music, changed from the 60s until now for you?
Well, when I said I had to deliver the music, um, I worked on a record with a girl I work with. In fact, tonight she's doing the performance at Birdland, and she did this record with the Count Basie band, and I had to modify the arrangements for three horns because she couldn't use the big band. So there were 15 arrangements that had to be rewritten. So for small projects like that, it's possible to do them. Uh, it just becomes uh, cost prohibitive if you get a copyist to do them. So I sort of have a fee that I do them all myself. And I had the printed parts, and she lives up the street. So I drove 10 minutes up the street and dropped them off.
Did you have the Basie scores to work from, or did you have to use your ear?
No, I had the scores, but um, there were a lot of mistakes in them, and a lot of things that the musicians played that weren't in the parts. Uh, and some of the arrangements, um, in fact, it was difficult to try to work it out because a lot of the piano parts only had chords. So if she went to perform where the piano wasn't playing for 4 bars, there were rests. So I mean, it had to be modified.
Yeah. I have a score or two that just crack me up because the arranger, instead of, writing first alto, whatever, they'd actually put the names down of the guys.
Right,
I
right.
just, that's history, man. I love it.
Yeah, well, there were a couple of them that were written that way too.
Yeah. What possessed you? I'm wondering if there was an aha moment, or because I was looking at the top 10 list of various years, and in the late 50s, early 60s, there was such a variety of things. I mean, 1949, you had Bird with Strings, and then 1950, the Third Man theme, and Nat King Cole, Roger Williams, Rock Around the Clock. Did some particular tune or style make a big impression on you?
That's a good question because um, prior to me going and playing in the bar when I was 15, I remember over the summer I started to listen more closely to the radio. And um, I heard um, I heard the four freshmen sing Day by Day. And I went and I bought the record. And also I heard Johnny Ray sing Cry and The Little White Cloud That Cry. In fact, I eventually wrote an arrangement that I really, really liked for Ronnie Millsap with a big band and strings on the song Cry, which actually became one of the, for a while was like my favorite go-to one to play for my friends. But my my background was sort of eclectic because my mother listened only to country music. And my father, being a musician, uh, would listen to WNEW, which would play Sinatra and those type records. So my exposure when I was like 10 to maybe 13 was sort of very eclectic. I didn't realize it then, but eventually all of these things would eventually play into something that I didn't realize that I had a gift, and I can't take credit for it. It's something. Every now and then you look on the internet, you see some kid 4 years old that could play Beethoven, and you say, "Oh my God, how could they do that?" And there's no logical way to explain it other than it's a gift. But I didn't recognize my gift until I was in my 60s because if you've written arrangements, one of the things you realize is that you write an arrangement and it's never what you want. You never get it to be what it, there's always something that you just struggled with. And for years, I listened to records on the radio and I should have written it. I should have changed that. And there's a large degree of perfectionism that you never really reach. And as a result of it, I didn't realize that the true gift was not writing the notes on the paper. It was coming up with the idea.
Do you
And for some reason, instinctively, I was gifted to come up with ideas. Like we need the Four Seasons. We need an intro, and there's scuffling. So I go to the piano on Candy Girl, and I played this. I played 4 chords, and I says, "How's this?" They said, "What did you do?" and and uh, to take "Dawn Go Away," which was written as a folk song, and uh, make it sound like it was an up-tempo song with a different rhythm, different chord changes. And I realized only later on that my true gift was coming up with the idea and making the idea and turning them into records where I didn't really write um, to please me as much as I wrote to try to invoke a feeling in the audience I was writing for.
You know who said something very similar was Ray Conniff. He
Yeah.
he was writing for big bands and he was very happy doing it, but he was writing for the guys, he said. And then he got interested. The band leader got interested. Write some bop for us. He said, "Nah, I don't want to." And then he was out of work, and he thought, I've been writing for the musicians. What if I wrote for the people who are buying the records? And I'm so happy to hear you say that. And I don't know if you recall, but we had a phone conversation about a year ago, and I saved my notes. And you said, "I wait for the song to talk to me."
Ah, yes. And this is the 50th anniversary of Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run album. And I wrote the strings on Jungle Land. And the first time I really realized that I had to wait for the song to talk to me was when I wrote that arrangement. Normally, I could write an arrangement for strings, a couple hours. So I went down to my office in New Jersey, to my basement, and I said, "Oh, I got to write the two arrangements for the session tomorrow." I started at 11 o'clock. I figured I'd be right till about 2 in the morning. I'd knock them off. It took me 6 hours to write that arrangement because I finally listened to the song and I finally listened to where the record was going. And I met with Bruce, and Bruce knew he wanted strings on a record, but really couldn't identify exactly what he wanted. In fact, in the meeting, he just after 10 minutes, he says, "No, you do it." He says, I'll see you tomorrow." But what was really interesting about it is eventually I started to hear what I needed to put on the record. And it sort of changed the way I approach writing string arrangements. Uh, but that was a process that was coming because I had made several arrangements that I remembered. I just had to sit there and wait for it to come.
Was it partly the lyric content that led you in the direction?
I can't really say that it was any one thing. Um, for many years, I recorded Roberto Carlos, who is from Brazil, and I didn't understand Portuguese, and play he would play me his demo on a piano or on a keyboard that he had recorded, and I'd hear him sing it in Portuguese, but he would tell me what it meant in English. And as he would tell me the story, I could get the feeling of what he was saying. And the interesting part about I learned about making records is when you listen to a record, you may not remember what the lyric says. You may not remember what the melody was all at one time, but you'll really remember how it made you feel. So the whole idea was to get you to feel exactly what I felt making the arrangement. And if I could sit there and get chills when I was writing and say, "Oh, I can't wait to hear this," I knew my enthusiasm being poured into the paper would eventually invoke a feeling in somebody else because we all feel joy, we all feel love, we all feel all these passions. And well, maybe you didn't get it, but that person will get it. And maybe that person get the feel, but there'll be two other people here that'll get it. And that was a process of going through and learning that if it killed me when I was writing it, it would kill. Then I could just say, so what have you been doing, Charlie? I said, hey, check this out. And I knew that because they were on the same plane. If they heard it, they would get the same feeling.
That's a great statement. Where did you start to write? I'm going to rephrase. When you first started to write, did you need to be at the sessions so that if things went awry or a note needed to be fixed, you were there for it? And then did they get a point where you didn't have to be there anymore?
I wrote all the arrangements that I wrote. I conducted on the session. I never wrote for anyone to go and well, maybe once or twice that may have happened, but it wasn't a primary thing in my career. There were times I wrote arrangements that I didn't get credit for, uh, which one was all by myself. Uh, the artist took the credit for the arrangement, uh, and when the musicians in the band were looking for the score, they knew who to call.
You can't see this, but I'm looking at the wall in front of me, and I have a printout of the top 100 Charlie Calello hits and arrangements. And I've zoomed in on a couple, and I want to sort of dissect this, the Lover's Concerto, if you don't mind, because as you said, this hit a nerve with me, and I noticed that I really got into the deep end with this because I was timing how long was the melody, and the first phrase is like 16 seconds, and then there's two of them, 16-second intro, and then the whole first verse, I'll call it, is 46 seconds. So part of an arrangement is like, well, we need more than a minute of music here, so we have to stretch this out. And was it your idea to go through 5 keys?
No. Um, in fact, when I made that record, um, I'll back up a couple of beats. Sandy Linzer wrote the song with Denny Randall. Sandy Linzer also wrote Don't Go Away with Bob Gaudio, and he became one of the writers on the Four Seasons. My father actually introduced me to him. So after they had a couple of hit records with Bob Crew, they decided to produce a record on their own. So I would sit with them and they would play me the song, and then I would write the arrangements while they were sitting there. And what was interesting about it was we worked on the arrangements together. But now I did something that I didn't realize I did. On the introduction, when it started with the concerto. Right after that, I wrote the intro to Stop in the Name of Love. No, what was it? And unconsciously, I wrote it because it went like this. Boom, beam, boom, 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 boom. Now, and when I heard it on the radio, I said to myself, how could you do it? But the funny part about it, it just needed something there, and it seemed to fit the groove. And we never got busted for it. Nobody ever called it to my attention. And as I would remind people about it, they'd say, "Oh yeah, it really does sound." But now, when they played me the song, they played me the modulations. Uh, when my father actually played trumpet on that record. But
That's
this was really funny. It was the fourth song on the session to give you some idea as to how quickly we made the record. Vinnie Bell, who was one of the guitar players on the set, said, "Charlie, you got 5 minutes. You're going to get this fourth song done." So I said, oh yeah, let's do it right now. So I played the intro, only the intro, the first verse, just to get the feel. And I said to the engineer, record it. It was the first take. It was only one take on the track. So when they played, when we finished the record, uh, it was we didn't have the singers on yet, but the pop song that we were looking uh, to release, we finished. It still sounded great, but it was never released, and eventually it was a hit by another group, a group from Australia. I forget the name of the song, but Lover's Concerto was like the fourth song on the date. It wasn't something that we intended to even release it as a single.
it's curious. It's one of the few. There's a very short list of pop tunes that have titles that are never said in, the lyrics.
Right,
Did they
right.
have that? That was their title at that point.
Yeah. And Sandy Lindsay, who wrote the lyric, in my opinion, is really, really, really a brilliant lyric writer. He's written a lot of hits, um, all different types of hits, and he's written pop hits all the way up until the Backstreet Boys. So when you have somebody who is that prolific as a kid and has a sensitivity, if you read the story is it doesn't sound like it was written by a guy that had that kind of emotion.
That's true.
But he went on to write many, many brilliant songs.
At that time, what was the technology in a good studio? How many tracks were you?
4 track.
And you had 2 inch, 1 inch tape.
No, it was half-inch tape. 4 track was half-inch, and basically we would cut the tracks, and sometimes we'd use 2 tracks. We put the rhythm on one track, the horns on another track. Sometimes we would record on all 4 tracks, then mix it down, and sort of overdub on top of it. But we were uh, sort of in the embryonic stages of piecing records together as opposed to doing them live.
I have a rather silly anecdote. Years ago, I was in a dentist office and they had a radio station on or whatever. And I kept thinking something's off here. And, it was low. I couldn't. And then a Four Seasons record came on. And I'm going, all I'm hearing is the singing. And what it was is one of their speakers was out. So I'm like, oh my God, they were like panned hard left and hard
Yeah.
right. That was on purpose, I guess.
Well, the way we would record the Four Seasons, we'd record a track, and then we'd overdub on the track. And then after we did all the overdubs on a track, we'd mix it down to a mono and put the mono, we'd copy it onto the 4 track. Then uh, we would do the background voices. The background voices were done without the lead. So we would do the background voices, then we would do sound on sound. As we were recording the double track, we would be doing it in conjunction with playing. So now we have 2 tracks. Frankie would then sing the lead, and if he had to double, he still had a track to double, again, sound on sound, and we'd have one track to do strings or horns. So back then, the 4 tracks only made mono records. So when stereo came out to try to recreate it, the only thing that they did was they split it up sort of crazy. But the early four seasons records sound best as monos.
Did you at the time that you and the engineers, I think I know the answer to this, but did you ever speculate like, oh, if we only had, and fill in the blank, like that piece of gear that's sitting behind you, if we only had more tracks, if we only could do this.
Well, it's funny. It's funny about inventions. Um, you didn't know you needed a can opener until somebody put one together. You'd go and you'd figure out maybe I get a screwdriver or whatever it was. I'm using this as a sort of uh, uh, ridiculous kind of an illustration. But the fact is, you don't know you need something until somebody shows up with it. Says, "Oh boy, this is handy."
And you're in a digital world now with,
Yeah.
yeah. Is it harder to know when to stop because basically you can keep tweaking things to infinity?
Well, um, I've worked with some people that go past it. We get to the point where they should stop, and they're still looking to improve it. So I developed the phrase, "Well, what do you think? Is this better?" I would say it's not better, it's different. So it got to a point where you didn't make the record better, you just made it different. And the difference was not enough to affect the feeling. So as a result of a lot of insecurities, uh, people that I worked with that were producers wound up doing things and worked past where they should have stopped, where they had the record. They just went past it and lost the record.
Oh dear. And isn't there a budget in play here with most projects? Like,
Well,
okay, we have to stop now. You're over budget, and this record is now done.
there was a time. Well, take into consideration the Lovers Concerto session cost $3,000. Okay, right now, if I go to make a record, and I make some of the records in the range. Um, right now, we could do them by just cutting down on the band. We do them for about 10,000 a song. But really, a budget for like the Bublé record or something like that is about 20,000 a song. So they do 10, 12 songs. You're looking at $250,000. Years ago, we used to knock it off. Lightning Strikes was a $3,000 session. The Name Game was a $3,000 session. I'd cut the track, do the background voices, put the voice on, and I was finished with the record. I was finished with the Name Game the same day and heard it on the radio that night.
That doesn't happen today.
No, also, I had two chart records with Bobby Vinton. Bobby sang live with the orchestra in the room, and the engineer played the mix back as we left the studio, and that was the record. It was
Speaking of,
actually mixed. It was actually mixed, and that was the record.
yeah, speaking of lightning strikes, this is from about 2 weeks ago. Luke
Yeah,
Christie passed away. New York Times obituary, and this I'll read a bit of it, small bit. February 1966 with lightning strikes chart topper, marked by a sweeping arrangement by the producer Charles Calello, featuring glimmering piano, ringing church bells, and radiant backing vocals from a vocal trio, the Delicates. I think that's really hip that the New York Times mentioned the arranger.
well, we actually made that record at the piano. The group that we used were um, the Angels, Peggy Farina. Uh, they had the record My Boyfriend's Back, but we used them as the background singers. And they sang on all the records I did with Lou Christie. And we would get together because they didn't read music and we would work the record out around a piano. So before I would go into the studio, I knew what the record was going to sound like. There was the one thing that I didn't anticipate was the guitar solo. The guitar player did it as an overdub, and he played the guitar solo on a bass guitar. And also, what I did was after I laid out the records, I gave them to Artie Schreck to orchestrate. Now Artie was doing my sessions. I said, here's what we're gonna do. I want you to use the two baritone saxes, the bass trombone, the rhythm section, and here are the tracks. Just copy this and put it on the record. So although I arranged it, he did the orchestration. And the reason why I did it as a producer, I had the record made. If there was something somebody could bring to the table, I wanted to have it.
Well, he brought some low end to that with you
Well,
know,
that was a technique that I developed when I was doing the name game. The what I did was I had two baritone saxes and a bass trombone play octaves and fifth and a fifth. There were like musical power chords. And what was interesting about the name game, if you uh, listen to the record, it's sort of fun to analyze because the rhythm was like boom, 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 but the bass never played that. The bass played boom, 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 the boom, 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 boom. So what happened was, with my short Schillinger education, I learned that you could actually take different rhythms and make them work against one another. So while the low end was doing like boom, 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 they would boom, 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 and then with the African drums and everything, it was such a cool record to make. So I had established all those sounds, and this became like sort of my staple orchestra at that time. It's just like as the music changed, the instrumentation changed. In the 70s, well, after the 60s, when the music started to change, the orchestration started to change. I started to listen to the Bee Gees records, and when I did the arrangement to Sweet Caroline and wrote the bomb, 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 I took the instrumentation from a Bee Gees record. The Bee Gees were using two trumpets, two trombones, and strings. And I thought that a lot of the songs that I was getting asked to arrange sounded like they fit the BG bag. So I started to use that instrumentation.
I think I read,
Now,
I think I
later
read
on,
that. Go ahead.
later on, as the types of music changed, the orchestrations would change, and uh, how the records would be put together would be determined by the style and what was being played on the radio.
I believe I read that Neil Diamond gave you sort of a wishy-washy compliment on your work for Sweet Caroline.
Yeah, he walked out when I walked out of the studio, he says, "How was that, Neil?" He says, "Well, I didn't hear anything wrong with it."
Well, can I have a raise on that? I had a
But
fascinating chat with Bucky Pizzarelli once about all the studio work he did, and because I noticed sometimes there'd be upwards of three or more guitars,
mhm.
And he said the guys sort of had worked out, one's going to do boom, and one's going to play big chords, and the others, little lines. Did you like to see particular players in the studio that knew that kind of thing?
Here's what you see, because I never did anybody else, I never went to anybody else's sessions. So as an arranger, I had no idea what other guys did. I only knew what they did on the records. So in order to control the speed of how we can get the feel, I started to write the guitar parts out. I would write the rhythms and I would write some of the licks and I would indicate where I wanted the licks. And then I would write simile. But basically when I used three guitars or four guitars, I wrote the parts out. Not the little, like I would write the rhythms and I'd indicate what they should play where. And I didn't realize I did that until I went to California and I came back to New York after about a year and a half later, and I did an orchestra date. And one of the guitar players said to the other guitar player who was like new doing sessions, he said, "See, I told you, Calello used to write the parts out." So, and I heard him say that, and what was funny was I didn't really understand it because to me, this is the way I worked.
You didn't know you were doing something that most other people didn't.
Yeah, but uh, how I learned, in order for me to get the style, what I would do periodically is I'd go into the studio. If I was doing like somebody wanted to record um, like 10 songs and they wanted to do it for a project or something, I wouldn't write the arrangements. I'd go in with chord sheets, which is how we used to make the Four Seasons records uh, quickly. I'd write a P. We called them a PBA or PBG, piano bass guitar, and I'd write the main figures, the breaks, and they'd know where the cuts were, and then we'd give the parts out. No, you do this, do that, and you do this and that. So, and then we would talk it out. And what I would do periodically by doing that and giving it to the musicians, I'd hear what the new licks were and what the new styles were that they were playing. And I do that. And then what I do is I say, oh, they played this, but I want that here. I don't like that. I don't want them to do this. I want them to do it here. So then I would learn the little things that they would do and figure out where I wanted them in the arrangement.
Am I correct that you um, would not change your arranging style if you were also the producer?
Um, that's a very interesting question because up until um, up until 1968, I made Charlie Calello records. I went in and did Charlie Calello. I didn't know I was doing it, but I get called, I do this. This is what I did. The first time I realized I had to make somebody else's record was when I did the Laura Nyro Eli record. I met with Laura and uh, she was very, very different. She wrote songs where in the middle of the song, the feel would change, the tempo would change. She'd slow down. Uh, she'd uh, play songs that didn't need instruments, and then they'd need something. And I figured out that in order for me to make her record, I had to find out what the songs really, really needed. And that was the start of getting to that point. Now, this was 68. By the 70s, I had pretty much gotten to the but I didn't have the realization that this is what I was doing. But I learned how to take the song and the artist and try to record and not make a Charlie Calello record as much as try to make the artist record. It's sort of like if you listen to a Nelson Riddle arrangement, uh, as soon as it starts, you could tell it's Nelson. Just the way he put things together. And later on, when he did the record he did for that female singer, I forget her name. You could see he hadn't made a Sinatra record in a long time. He went and made the same record. There was a thing that he did that made Nelson. He was a brilliant record maker and brilliant arranger. Now, I had no idea that when I played my arrangements, I had people that recognized that I did Charlie Calello, that recognized that I didn't know I had a sound, but there were other people that identified the sound. So now, if you have that consistency, it's very, very difficult to then come out of that box and suddenly try to make a twist. Now, I didn't know I was really doing that when I went through the process. I appreciated that I had made that adjustment in the way I made records.
I had a quote from you from our conversation a year ago on the phone. You said, "We never got out of the sound box," but I can't remember what the context was. I think you're talking about that. And were you referring to Linda Ronstadt did a
Right. That was, yeah, I was referring
Nelson
to
Riddle?
this Ronstadt
Yeah.
record.
I think it's very interesting that other people heard that you had a sound, but you weren't aware of it. It's almost like critics naming styles of music that the musicians don't know. I mean, not that they don't know, but musicians were playing bebop, but they didn't call it bebop until the critics did.
Yeah. It was sort of taking into consideration. You mentioned something very, very early on about how rewarding it was to write arrangements, but there was also it was I recognized that my career would probably only last maybe 20, 30 years. And um, I had an office in the 60s at Al Gallico's office. You may not know who Al Gallico was, but he was a publisher, and he published Stand By Your Man, and he was basically Billy. I can't remember his name now. But every day, Hugo Winterhalter used to come in and sit down in his office and hang out with Al. Now, I grew up listening to Hugo Winterhalter, who was a key arranger on RCA Victor. But while I was making all these records and I was doing record after record, he didn't have work. And the reason why he didn't have work, the music style had changed. And as it changed, they didn't have the opportunity to make the change because they were stuck in this old bag. And they no longer spoke the language. Now, when I started to make the Four Seasons records, the studio musicians didn't speak the pop language. They had to be taught.
Straight eighths.
They didn't want to overdub. They were used to doing the whole thing. They didn't want to wear earphones. They couldn't play with earphones. It was very, very different. Now here we come along and we're sort of changing the face of the way that music was working. So I figured that there would come a time when I would not speak the language anymore. So after I had my run with Juice Newton, and I had a couple of country hits in the 80s, I actually had my last chart record in the 90s. And when I left to come here to Florida, it was 92. I never thought that I would be able to write anymore because the only business I knew was the record business. Little did I know, my wife was smart enough to know that I wasn't going to stop writing, so she donated my services to the Pops Orchestra. And and then I started to see the acts come in. They needed arrangements. They and I'm saying to myself, this, how come I didn't know about this?
And now you got a big band to write for.
Yeah, and well, the orchestrations change and a lot of things change. But the other thing about the insecurity of uh, not being current. Every time you write an arrangement, you're showing up to the date naked. You're letting it all hang out. You don't know if they're going to like it. They're not going to like it, and there's always something you know you did wrong. And it got to the point where uh, I really didn't I really didn't have a good understanding about where I was as an arranger until many years later.
Did you ever have a circumstance? You're talking about writing for a Pops orchestra, arranging something you had done years before, but you never had to notate and include the melody because someone was singing it. And then you're writing for a Pops orchestra with, let's say, a medley and no one is singing. All of a sudden, he's like, wow, I never wrote out Sherry Baby before, the actual melody of it.
Well, when I wrote the arrangements, I always wrote the melody on the top line,
Okay.
unless it was unless I was sweetening a record where they already had the singer on, where all I had to do was just write the parts. But when I when I when I started a when I started a session, the first thing I do is I write out the melody. I want to know what the melody is, and then I write out the basic chords. And then I'll change the chords as I go along, but do a basic layout because this is the song. Because every time I start an arrangement, I start with a blank page. So uh, I recently listened to four albums I did over the past couple of years, and I'd say, how did I come up with this? Where did I get this idea? And it puzzles me every time I do it. But as I'm writing the melody down, there's things that I'm picking up in my brain as I'm doing it, and there's just for some reason I think by writing the melody, it gives me an opportunity to at least get an idea as to where this thing is going to go. And for some reason, there's a way of putting it together where you don't have to write the same intro. It's always different, and you wonder where it's going to come from, but it always seems to come.
You have to step away sometimes and go do something else, go for a walk, and let your head work the thing out on its own.
Well, I recently did another record with Joe Boeri, which was a lot of fun. And he wanted to do Only Have Eyes for You. And he wanted it to sound like a pop record. And I love Bruno Mars. So I worked on the arrangement for 3 weeks until I came up with the idea. I worked on the song for 3 weeks and I finally came up with it. And I think the record is absolutely sensational, although very few people will hear it. But it was a Bruno Mars style. And I also took the Flamingos thing and the way I put it together, it's a totally different record, different song, and but it was something like I said, I don't have it yet.
It wasn't talking to you yet.
It wasn't saying, "Hey, Charlie, it needs this," but eventually it did. So if you want to get a chance to listen to it, it's on Joe Boeri's Lucky 13 new album, and it's Only Have Eyes for You. Now, then after I made the record, I turned the record over to a synth programmer who took my arrangement and tweaked it and made it in some ways better, some ways the same, but it's the essence of the record because all the backgrounds, the lead, the layout, everything, the chord structure, the feel, everything else, and it was all me. And I sort of listened to the record and I say, boy, that was a hard record to make.
Right. Well, this has just been a delight for me as an arranger myself. I very um, envious of your career. And another quote, one more quote from you. You, I was one of the cogs in the wheel of record producing. You were a large cog, I think.
Well, the position that arrangers have, um, it's sort of like the drummer who gets the groove on the record, and the bass player who reads the notes, but makes it feel like it's in the pocket. Um, any one of those guys missing could alter the outcome. And when you're working with a team and you're a cog in the wheel, you're one of the ones that's making that wheel turn. Now, in some cases, yeah, you play a more major part than this person over here or that person over there. But in essence, uh, pretty much everything that we do as arrangers, we're standing on somebody's shoulders. So, as far as our being original, we never really uh, can take total credit for being original because, uh, as John Lennon once said, difference between professionals and amateurs. Amateurs copy and professionals steal. Uh, the thing about writing, in my mind, I want the rhythm section to sound like a Diana Krall record. I want I want the horns to sound like a bassy record, and I want the strings to sound like Nelson wrote them. Now, how do I put that together? So you're constantly picking pieces and regurgitating them back to the paper. So in in your brain, uh, you're a cog.
Well,
I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think it does, and it's all worked for you. And I want to thank you for your time today. It's enlightening, and I know people are going to dig it.
Well, one of the things I'm glad that took place with this interview, you didn't ask me about any of the records and how you go about doing this, how you go about doing that. But some of the things that I'm most proud of that I've done recently, if you get a chance to actually get a chance to listen, I mentioned the Ronnie Millsap record. I did that 20 years ago, but I still love the arrangements I wrote on Ronnie's record. I only wrote 6 of the arrangements. I split the date with Sammy Nestico, which was a thrill for me. Um, Also, my Joe Boeri records, I think are amazing. I have a kid I just recorded, Chris Ruggiero, that uh, some of the arrangements in that they're all old pop tunes, but some of the arrangements were very, very cleverly constructed. And we went through a process of working with a couple of people that fed ideas into it, and it's all explained on the record. But the most joy has been over the past years, not chasing the market, but just writing what I really wanted to write.
And you well deserve that.
Thank you. Well, it was really nice doing this. I really, really enjoyed it. Thanks
It's
for
nice.
inviting me.
All right. I'll pause here and then we'll say our goodbyes,
Okay. All
Charles.
righty. Bye-bye.